Everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. We're very excited to welcome Professor Adelman. Before we get started, I want to remind you all that our next Marblehead Memories meeting, this is a monthly meeting that we have usually on the first Saturday of every month at 10 a.m. And of course, we've been doing it via Zoom since March or April. And we do a different theme every month. We've done various themes from the Great Race to restaurants and all sorts of things. And this month's theme is nicknames and funny stories about Marblehead. And we know that the nicknames of Marblehead go way back. Some we can't really talk about in present company, but I'm sorry, in present company, in polite company, but we'll go ahead and see what we can talk about. And we'd love to get your stories and what you know about the nicknames and the people who had those nicknames on record, if you will. So I hope you can join us via Zoom. You can get the Zoom link online at our website, marbleheadmuseum.org. In the upcoming programs page and in the Marblehead Memories page. And there's more info about the Marblehead Memories project and various ways that you can participate on our website. So hopefully you can join us on Saturday and check out more information. Also, we want to announce, because it's actually a brand new event, that on October 17th, we're joining up with Discover Marblehead, great organization, to hold a fall festival of craft vendors in the Lee Mansion Garden. It's free to enter. We have 20 vendors, and I hope you will join us to support the local, they're all local businesses and crafters, and I hope you'll come support them and have a good time in the Lee Mansion Garden. And if we have rain on the 17th, we're gonna do it on the 18th. So hope you'll join us for that. And as usual, I want to thank Marble Harbor Investment Council for their support of the lecture series, which makes all of this possible. So we certainly appreciate it. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started, if that's all right. So again, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Joseph Adelman. He's an associate professor of history at Framingham State University. He earned his BA and MA from Harvard University and his PhD from Johns Hopkins University. Professor Adelman won the 2011 Rita Lloyd Maroney Jr. Prize for Scholarship in Postal History from the U.S. Postal Service for his article, A Constitutional Conveyance of Intelligence, Public and Private. So we're super excited to have you, Professor, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you to Amy as well for all the work you did to coordinate and organize this event. I know we had planned initially to do this in person in April, and this is actually, I had a couple of talks scheduled in April. This is the one that I was second most disappointed to have canceled. I was supposed to give a talk in my hometown in New York where I grew up, so that was first. But this was the second one because I've actually never been to the Marblehead Museum, so I'm disappointed that we weren't able to do it in person, but I'm glad we're still able to do it this way. You know, so this way you can sit back, relax, and eat some popcorn or whatever snack or drink you'd like. I'm here tonight to talk about my book, which was published last year, called Revolutionary Networks. And I'll make sure to self-market with a picture at the end of the PowerPoint. But the title of the talk is A Revolution in the News, and I am now going to stall for 3 seconds while I pull up the slideshow so I can go ahead and start the formal talk. Okay. I want to begin tonight with a story set on Christmas Eve, 1773. A man rides down the street in Philadelphia and dismounts in front of the printing office of William Bradford. He has news from Boston. Bradford takes a set of papers from the man, a Boston-based express rider and silversmith named Paul Revere. Back in his shop, Bradford and his apprentices worked quickly to set type for a single page of newspaper text. As a header, Bradford titles the sheet, A Christmas Box for Customers of the Pennsylvania Journal, his weekly newspaper. Tension had filled the air in Philadelphia for weeks as twin dramas played out. The first was the local wait for a ship destined for its wharves, loaded with East India Company tea to be sold by monopoly to the colonists. The Sons of Liberty, the city's anti-imperial newspaper printers, and political leaders had worked for weeks to ensure that residents would treat the tea as a tyrannical expression of authority. At the same time, reports began to flow from the eastward, and Philadelphians read eagerly as they heard that 3 tea ships had landed at Boston, that the customs officer had refused to clear the rest of the ship's goods without also clearing the tea, that the governor wouldn't let the ships leave, and that the Sons of Liberty wouldn't, under any circumstances, allow the tea to land. Now the climactic news was here. Boston's patriots, their faces disguised with soot, had dumped 340 chests of the East India Company tea into Boston Harbor. The Christmas box would announce the news to Philadelphians. The resulting document, which you can see here, shows the confluence of media and communications networks that I describe in the book. This broadside, this one-page sheet, includes information that comes from printed sources, manuscript handwritten sources, and oral sources, if I may take you through them. So first, I put these in 2 red boxes, are excerpts from a newspaper called the Massachusetts Spy, published by Isaiah Thomas on the morning of December 16th, just before the tea was dumped. These excerpts include updates about town meetings that were happening in Faneuil Hall and the Old South Meeting House, the work of the ship's owner, Francis Roach, to negotiate something between the Sons of Liberty and the governor who was in hiding in Milton, some resolutions by the town of Lexington swearing that they would not drink British tea, and so on. So that's from a printed source. At the end of the second column, in the green box in the bottom right corner, Bradford reprinted a letter that was forwarded from the New York Committee of Correspondence, in which the Boston Committee had written a celebration of the tea's destruction. And then last in the middle in yellow is a section that actually describes the dumping of the tea on the night of December 16th. Now, one thing to know about this description, it appears nowhere else in print that I've been able to find. And you simply have to take it on faith that I've looked a lot. After Thursday, the next publication day for Boston newspapers was the following Monday, December 20th. And by then, the account was a little bit different in its language and in some of its particulars than what appears here. My best guess then is that this is the report delivered by none other than Paul Revere when he walked into the office from the streets when he arrived in Philadelphia. This single sheet, therefore, embodies a series of networks. This document became possible because of the work of committees, of course, and Paul Revere, and we can't forget Paul Revere's horse, but it also existed because of the networks that printers created, the people who published news, as part of their everyday work in their trade. So this is the revolution, and print is actually a pretty well-trod topic, but my interest in the topic comes from something that was missing in how most scholars talked about publishing in the American Revolution. So people have written about the arguments that Thomas Paine and John Dickinson and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, and even people not named Thomas or John, made either against or in support of imperial policies. And the scholars who write about this often emphasize the importance of these arguments appearing in newspapers or pamphlets, and sometimes note the crucial role of circulation. These in print, therefore, means more people had access. If they circulated, more people were reading them in different places. But that's it. They stop just at the fact of circulation without exploring the process of what happens or its meaning. At heart, my work is about peeling back the layers to see how the news gets made. Because it turns out that something important happened during the process of getting material printed, distributed, and circulated, work that took place inside and between printing offices. On the surface, these texts, even the miscellaneous collected paragraphs of the colonial newspaper, which this page is a basic design in the same basic design, they appear to offer a relatively coherent argument. It's a relatively smooth look, but that smoothness and that clarity obscure what's going on behind the scenes. Printers exerted significant influence on the texts, arguments, and news about the revolution, and they did so in ways that reflected their own political and business perspectives, as well as the business networks and practices in which they engaged. In other words, when we think about the business decisions of printers, how they're running their shop every day, and then think about the material composition and circulation of text, literally how they get put together, constructed, we can learn a great deal about how political arguments became both salient and popular between the 1760s and 1780s. But to take a step back, let's start with a more basic question, because I've spent 15 years with printers and not everybody knows what I mean when I say that term. Who were they and what did they do? So for the book, I created a database of over 750 printers who were active in the second half of the 18th century. That let me trace their careers, linkages among printers, and make some general statements about them as a group. So first, on the socioeconomic spectrum, they fell somewhere in the mushy middle. That's a technical term, of course. From the super successful Benjamin Franklin to those whose careers, if we can even use that word, were so brief that I had trouble finding anything other than one imprint on which their name appeared. The printing trade, one of the reasons that I found it fascinating is it puts the printers, puts these men and women at a hinge point of society. On the one hand, they were manual laborers, they were artisans, they were tradesmen, they worked with their hands and their bodies doing physically demanding work. I don't know how many of you have actually seen an 18th century printing press in action of pulling the press and doing that work. But at the same time, they interacted and mingled with the elite of society. They usually had to be literate, and although further back in the colonial era, that's less true. By the Revolution, it's basically true that they're all literate. And they're in fact sometimes writing some material, especially for their newspapers. They also, compared to most colonists, had a somewhat broader geographic view. Simply by necessity, most towns could support at most one printer. Salem had one printing office. I don't think Marblehead even had one before the Revolution. So you train as an apprentice in a printing office for 7 years, and then in order to become a master printer yourself, if you're in a town that can only support one printer, you have a few options. You can marry your master's daughter and join his business, which happened, obviously, or you can leave and go somewhere else. And so that happens quite a bit, that people are making contacts across the colonies, they're working in various different towns as they're making their way in the trade. And when they go set up shop, they're doing it somewhere different from where they trained. And even when they're in the same place, they're needing to keep connections with other colonies, because that's how you get the news, is from people in other places. They need to have connections with, if you're in Boston, with people in New York and Philadelphia and Charleston to have news. So sometimes these are through networks of kinship. The most famous of these in colonial America was the Green family. The Greens were the very first printers in New England at Harvard in the 1640s. And by the 1760s, there were about 40 or so cousins working from Annapolis all the way up through New England. The other is through business connections that, and Benjamin Franklin is the one who's most famous. He makes a bunch of partnerships and agreements with people as he's making his way to the top of the trade. Printers are producing a broad range of materials. They're doing a whole variety of things. So the biggest thing is essentially job printing, what we would call going to Staples and asking somebody to run off copies of something, right? So printing to order, almanacs, pamphlets, newspapers, if you could, broadsides, which are essentially one-page text posters, and other materials. They do pre-printed forms. If you wanted to borrow money, there's a form you can use to write those kinds of things. They printed very few books. Books are really expensive to produce, and it's cheaper actually just to import them, not so much from London the way that copyright worked, but to get them usually from Dublin actually was a very popular place to get their books from, which wasn't under English copyright, so they could be cheaper. They often ran side businesses selling stationery or books, most commonly, things that are related to printing. They tried to get government contracts. It's hard to make money, but a government contract means you're going to get paid pretty regularly to print copies of the laws, copies of the journals of the assembly, the governor's papers, things like that. Literally printing money. If there's an account for printing paper money, you want that. You make money to make money. And they also seek government positions. So a lot of them want to serve, some of my early workers on the post office, and this is why they want to be in the post office as postmasters, because that means they are an information node. It means they're getting things first. And we could talk about the post office for hours if we wanted later, but just in the 18th century, you had to go to the post office to pick up your mail. So you go into the post office, you open your letter, and the postmaster says, "So, anything interesting in that letter from London?" And then may have some material. So even with all of this work, printing is a difficult trade in which to succeed economically. Franklin becomes wealthy, but he's the exception that proves the rule. So most printers, and this is even more true if you're the only one in town, try to avoid appearing too partisan in their publications, lest they lose any significant business. If a town is only big enough barely to support one printer, and you make half the town angry, you're going out of business. So they're adopting a free press strategy, actually, that Franklin himself had outlined in 1731 in what's now known as his Apology for Printers, which he printed in his Pennsylvania Gazette. He essentially recommended that printers adopt what he called a free and open press as a strategy, meaning one that was free from government interference, so no licensing of printing beforehand, no censorship of printed materials afterwards, and one that was open to all parties, essentially making your press a public forum. There's an ideological component to this, to be sure, but the free and open press is as much a business strategy as anything else. As with all things, Franklin, the appearance of being free and open was critical to avoiding controversy, and Franklin and a lot of others used that appearance to be able to then make political statements in their newspapers under the logic of, well, I'm open to all, and so of course I have to print this essay that I secretly wrote. So politics, of course, did appear in any of the print media that printers produced, but I focus a lot of my energy on newspapers because it's a place we can watch news circulate and see the hand of what printers are doing most clearly. They're important for a printing office, not because they were lucrative, they were not, but because they put a printer's work into the community on a regular basis, and because they did provide some steady revenue, especially with advertising, which you actually could get people to pay for, and subscriptions, which they often struggled with getting people to pay for. So when we look at a colonial newspaper, such as this beautiful high-resolution scan from the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, you can see at first why, for a long time, historians of politics and journalism discounted the role of printers. So what you see here are pages 1 and 4. All newspapers were published weekly, basically. They were printed on one large sheet of paper that was then folded once to make 4 pages. So this is the way it would have been on the press. You would have printed pages 1 and 4, the outside pages at the same time. And if you look at these 2 pages, I realize it's hard to see unless you've got me blasting on your big screen TV, and if you do, I'm sorry. That pretty much everything that's on these 2 pages is advertising. And that for a successful newspaper is pretty common. You'd sometimes have on page 1 some London news or a longer essay, but you often have things that are in stock early in the week. You need the whole week to set the type. And so you have the advertisements first. So you set those and run them off. And then on the inside pages is where you have news. And if you look at this newspaper, it's hard to see, but I have, oops. Just remembered from working with my students. Sorry, I'm going to go back to this. If you can see the cursor now, that is the word Philadelphia. That little paragraph is the local news for that week. That's it. What's below it then is ship arrivals and departures, so it's news of a local sort, but that little paragraph, which is too small for me to see on my screen and I don't remember offhand what it's about, that's it. That's the local news. So most historians of journalism have looked at this and said, well, nothing original in here, so there must not be much to see. But that obscures the work that's going on to make this 4-page newspaper. So to give you an example, I always use Boston, because I know the population of Boston is about 15,000 in about 1770. The audience for news of a local context is actually rather small when you think about it, because the audience is primarily men of middle and upper class status. and especially upper class status. So if you think of a town of 15,000, half the town is children, half of the adults are women, so we're already down under 4,000 people. Half of those people are not wealthy, are poor, or working poor, if not more. Right? So we're talking about maybe 1,000 to 1,500 men as the main audience for the newspaper. They're not the sole people who read the newspaper, of course, but in terms of thinking about the audience, and even other people, if you're interested in what's going on in Boston, you ask somebody. They're all piled in on a tiny little peninsula. You just talk to somebody and you find it out. You want stuff from other places. You want to see what's going on elsewhere. So printers are actually doing a lot of work to get to this, and you can't really see probably, but on this page we have news, an essay to the printer, and then news from Savannah, Georgia, Charleston, South Carolina, from Boston, that's Newport and New York, before we get to the things from Philadelphia. Because I have this image, if you're interested in the book, the introduction goes through for like 4 pages, exactly what's in this issue of this newspaper. So they're getting material from 3 sources, as I hinted at the beginning. Number 1, oral reports. Literally, people are walking into the newspaper office and saying, we just heard, or I just got off the boat from Bristol and I have the latest from London 7 weeks ago. Here's what's going on in Parliament. And then you'll literally see in the newspaper, we hear that, a paragraph that starts that way. And sometimes I think it's a rhetorical device. And sometimes I think it's very clearly that, like, the captain of the ship got off the ship, walked in with his mailbag and said, oh, by the way, here's everything that I know that's going on. They get things that are handwritten in manuscript. You want to be the postmaster because people are opening their letters in front of you. And then they may say, oh, I've got this interesting paragraph from a friend of mine who's a merchant in Bristol or wherever. And then other printed reports. So especially other newspapers. The post office allowed free circulation of individual copies of newspapers between the printers to generate, if you shopkeeper wanted to buy the Pennsylvania Journal and you lived in Boston, you have to pay your subscription. But the printer of the Boston Gazette, theoretically at least, does not. He can send one of his newspapers to Philadelphia and get one back in return for free. And that's what they're using. So the Georgia Gazette from Savannah and the South Carolina Gazette from Charleston and the Newport Mercury, because not all of them were called gazettes, from Newport, Rhode Island, and so on, right? That those are the sources of news that you just know that that's where it's from. So the job of the printer is to navigate these sets of inputs, and it's often portrayed as passive. If I've read one history that talks about it as scissors and paste journalism, I've read a dozen or so. But it actually is very important and shapes the news. Let me give you a small example of a smoking gun example that I have from my research. So on the left, you see it's got a line across it and then across the top, and then it says Chatham, July 11th. That's the New Jersey Journal for July 11th, published in Chatham, New Jersey, which was near where the Continental Army was encamped. So they had a newspaper printing right there, reporting on a naval engagement off the coast of St. Croix in the Caribbean. British Admiral Rodney lost his leg in this battle, and it reports that the French won a resounding victory. This copy of this newspaper from New Jersey made its way to Worcester, Massachusetts, where Isaiah Thomas, who was in Boston during the Tea Party, and then he left right before Lexington and Concord for Worcester. He saw that, he got a copy of that. In fact, this very copy, because we can see where he marked with a pen on the side that he wanted that reprinted. But when he did that, he read it, he added 4 little words that, because of the passage of time, are hard to read. He wrote at the end, in brackets, "This account wants confirmation." And so when it's on the right, printed in the Massachusetts Spy in Worcester, the story is reprinted exactly, reset in type by Thomas and his employees. And at the end, it says, "This account wants confirmation." This is a very small thing in the grand scheme, but printers are doing this all the time. And in this case, what Thomas did, and I don't have any evidence for why he would have done this, I literally just happened to, the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester has Thomas's newspapers. And so I was able to actually see this in the reading room. He changed it from a straight news story to a rumor, right? He downgraded the news with this one little notation. That's power. Multiplied dozens of times each week in choosing, right? He didn't have to choose this paragraph to reprint at all, and he did, but adding it as a rumor. So this is the kind of work that they're doing. They're doing this work going back into the earliest decades of the 18th century, when newspapers get their start in colonial America. It's just the normal course of business. You get the other town's newspapers, you select out things you want to have reprinted, you and your employees set the type and reprint it in your newspaper. It's just ordinary practice of business. That then gets turned into a political valence in the 1760s when the imperial crisis begins. And so what I'm arguing essentially is that printers are making the revolutionary protests, making the imperial crisis what it is, using these business strategies through this selection process. So I'll start with a little case study of the Stamp Act of 1765. So if you've never taken an early American history course, survey course with me, in March of 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, which provided for a tax on all manner of printed goods in amounts ranging from half a penny to a few pounds, depending on the document that was being printed. This had existed in England. Massachusetts had actually passed its own stamp tax during the 7 Years' War to help fund its militia. Stamp taxes as a genre of thing were not foreign to anybody in the Anglo-Atlantic world. This one was super comprehensive. I've reproduced just 2 pages of the law here, where you can see each paragraph is a different thing that's getting taxed for a different value. It's comprehensive. It taxes newspapers, almanacs, pamphlets, books, legal documents like mortgages and filings at the court, commercial records like bills of lading, manifests, commissary notes, that would be food, promissory notes. They taxed dice and playing cards. Like, they got everything on this. One of the things that we therefore know is that it's a tax on basically all manner of public activity, and it's a tax on printers. It raises the price of every single thing that happens in the printing office. But at first, printers reacted by doing what made the most sense to them. They tried to make money. So they immediately run off pamphlet editions of the Stamp Act and hawk them on the streets. They print excerpts of the Stamp Act in their newspapers and their almanacs, and they use the onset of the tax as of November 1st, because at first they assume it's going to take effect, as advertising material. And the place that it's easiest to see this is in almanacs, or with almanacs. So the tax is supposed to take effect on November 1st. You buy your almanac for the following year, so they're usually on sale in November and December. So what the printers do is, instead of printing them in October, November for sale in November, December, they start running them off in August. And then they advertise. So here's an example from the Providence Gazette of William Goddard advertising and noting, I've circled in red just to make sure you don't miss it, that his almanac is unstamped, and including lines, this one doesn't have it, but including lines like essentially saying buy now before the price goes up.
I have to pick up a...
This is going to be more expensive after November 1st, so you want to get yours now. So it's a marketing opportunity. Throughout the crisis then, what happens next in August through November is that in 13 of the British colonies, and we're going to talk about 13 more in a second, protests force the people appointed to enforce the act to resign from their position as stamp officers. There are parades in the street. They're marching effigies of the ministers who wrote the Stamp Act and, of course, burning them. They're threatening the houses of the stamp officers to get them to resign. Newspapers are reporting on all of this. And the printers are shaping the coverage through choosing which accounts to reprint, through choosing when to tell these stories. So in one case, there's a New York printer named John Holt, who's a reliable son of liberty. But during the Stamp Act riots in Boston, he simply reprints a proclamation by the Massachusetts governor and pulls off all the identifying information. So he's reprinting what the loyalist, the British official, is saying without any hint to his readers that that's what he's doing. And then the news just dominates. In the Boston Evening Post, in just one issue, there's protests from Boston, because there's 2 riots in Boston. There's protests in New London, Connecticut, Norwich, Newport, and Providence. Resignations of stamp officers in Virginia, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and New York. And a list of things that were stolen from Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson's house in one of the riots. This is just one issue of one newspaper. And this is a new thing. A lot of the news prior to 1763 had come from London. There was a real hub and spoke model in terms of the kinds of interest that people had. They were interested in what was going on in London more than they were interested in what's happening in their colonies. And this is a moment where the other colonies suddenly jump up into the fore. They also portrayed paper as having enormous power to harm the colonists. It's actually wild to read some of these accounts and the ways in which they think that the act of paper or the stamp itself is going to hurt people. So around November 1st, one of the things that printers do and protesters in the towns is they hold mock funerals for their newspapers, like literally marching through the streets with coffins that are labeled freedom of the press. They do graphic design on their newspapers. So this is not Halloween decorations in this October 31st issue. This is a gravestone for the newspaper itself. With these black lines are called mourning borders. The previous time the Pennsylvania Journal probably would have used these would have been 5 years earlier when King George II died. And then the skull, right? The imagery is self-evident, I hope. The stamp or the skull and crossbones down in the right corner, that's where the stamp was supposed to go. So if you focus in, it's an emblem of the effects of the stamp. And if that front page doesn't get you, on the back page, there's also a little advertisement where Bradford has printed this coffin with an epitaph, the last remains of the Pennsylvania Journal, which departed this life the 31st of October, 1765, of a stamp in her vitals, aged 23 years. A little melodramatic, perhaps, but also very vivid, very strong sense of what's going on. So after November 1st, the act does not take effect between New Hampshire and Georgia, but there's 13 other colonies. Canada doesn't like to be called the 13 other colonies, but Canada and the Caribbean islands are also British colonies. There are some protests in those areas, but the act still takes effect. So there are stamped papers, and some have survived. So this is from the Antiquarian Society again. In the lower right corner, you can see an actual stamp. That would have been, this is not my kids don't know what a lick 'em and stick 'em stamp is. They think stamps are all stickers. But it's imprinted, right, like a ink pad, or actually just literally physically imprinted, embossed into the paper, depending on what it is. So that's what a real stamp looks like in the corner of the newspaper. And there's these pieces of paper floating around the Atlantic world, some commercial documents, things like that, from Barbados, from Halifax, from Jamaica, are carrying the stamp. And occasionally one shows up, even though business is quite reduced in what become the United States colonial ports. Occasionally a piece of paper shows up. So in February of 1766, one of these pieces of paper shows up in Boston. They never say exactly what type of paper it is, but it has a stamp on it. And so they arrest it and march it through the streets of the town. Then they put the paper on trial, for violating the rights of Bostonians as Englishmen and trampling on the principles of the Constitution. This is a very Boston story. According to newspaper reports, they convene a jury, which deliberates for 2 hours. I should point out at this point that they're meeting in a tavern. Find the paper guilty of violating Magna Carta and the British Constitution, and pronounce a death penalty. They then march it through the streets some more, over to the Liberty Tree, where they have effigies of George Grenville, who authored the Stamp Act, and Lord Bute, who was a Scotsman, and Bostonians hated the Scots, and was a minister to King George. At that point, they thought that he was misleading King George and not that George was the problem. But they have effigies of these two ministers, and they burned the 3 of them, Bute, Grenville, and the piece of paper, in a public ceremony. Well, what do you do then? You write about it in the newspaper and include a very rare image. There are very few images in colonial papers. Most of them are what we would describe now as stock images. These are all woodcuts. They have to be individually carved. That's expensive. That's time consuming. There's not a lot of artistic sophistication in the colonies. There's some, and actually some of the best engravers were enslaved people working in printing offices, as it turns out. But the images would be a ship a horse, the kind of thing you could reuse over and over. This is custom made, where you've got Butte on the left, I assume, in his kilt, Grenville on the right, the piece of paper, and who's holding the piece of paper? The devil. They have a really strong sense that the paper and the stamp are threatening them. This is my favorite story of the entire book. There's other good stories, but this is my favorite story to tell. Over the ensuing years, the Stamp Act eventually does get repealed. Basically, British officials throw their hands up and say, they're never going to pay this. We're fine. We'll get rid of it. So printers, over then a series of other protest movements over the next 6-7 years, work to solidify the connections they've been making among one another, with governments and political organizations, with extra-legal organizations such as the Sons of Liberty and the Committees of Correspondence. This is my way of skipping ahead back to 1773 and the Tea Act, where we started with the Christmas box, because I only told you the first half of the story. It turns out that at the beginning, this is great to show you how these media forms come together. This very quickly becomes news you can use. You've probably never heard of a Philadelphia Tea Party. That's because this prevents it. So here's what happens. It shows up, or Revere shows up 8 days after the Boston Tea Party on December 24th. That's a really hard ride. News usually takes at least 2 weeks to get from Boston to Philadelphia, about what it takes now on I-95. So it shows up on Christmas Eve. The very next day on Christmas morning, out in Delaware Bay, people spot the tea ship Polly headed for Philadelphia. Knowing what had happened in Boston, they send a delegation out to the ship. They stop the ship far enough out that the customs officials don't have control over the ship. So that's not a problem as it was in Boston. They bring the ship captain into Philadelphia to a huge town meeting. They ever so politely show him this news from Boston and suggest that he might not want to bring his ship into town. Might want to turn around. He consents. They give him 3 huzzas. They offer to provision him for his 8-week return journey across the Atlantic in the dead of winter. I feel a lot of sympathy for the sailors who spent 6 or 8 weeks out on the Atlantic in November and December, may have gotten to hop off the ship for a few minutes in rural Delaware, and then are back on the ship for a 6 or 7 week trip back to England through the bitterest part of the winter. There is no Philadelphia Tea Party. They avert it with this very news, and it gets to Philadelphia because of all these networks. These very small things that Isaiah Thomas is doing in his printing office are there and ready to be mobilized, ready to be activated when these big moments come. Of course, that changes when the war starts in 1775. The war caused huge difficulties for the printing trade. It made business far more difficult in a whole variety of ways. Most importantly, it caused dislocation. The armies are crisscrossing the colonies and then the states. And as various armies pass through towns, the other side's printers bail. So the British occupy almost every Atlantic port at some point. And so at some point, almost all the pro-American printers have to leave town. When the British Army isn't there, the loyalist printers beat a pretty quick path out of town because they're nervous about themselves. It's war. So almost half of all printers who were active in 1775 were forced out of their offices. This is not, I wouldn't try to read this too closely at the moment. Take it as a sort of impressionistic glance that each circle represents the printers who had to abandon a town and their political affiliation. The larger the circle, the more printers. But you can see this is almost every place where printing is happening in 1775 that somebody had to leave. There's also something ironic that happens. Before the war, they're mixing and matching their business interests and their political interests. During the war, they get very evenly cleaved in half. Before you start printing, it's a very political decision. Am I safe here? Will the Continental Army protect? Well, the Continental Army won't protect you. They're not very strong. But is the British Army here or not? If they are, and I'm a loyalist, I'm staying. If they're here and I'm not a loyalist, I'm out of here, and then vice versa. And then after that, it's almost entirely economic because it's really hard to stay afloat. There's problems getting paper, there's problems getting ink, there's problems getting news. All of this becomes hugely problematic during the war. not to mention the problem of losing most of your young labor to military action. The war was particularly catastrophic for loyalists, people who stayed loyal to the British Crown, who hadn't developed nearly the same ties as other printers as a group. Their networks, most printers tended to be connected to a lot of people very loosely. The loyalists tended to be very concentrated. They had very insular networks with one another. And especially through ethnic links of immigration, there's a large immigrant Scottish printer community, or a significant one. They're not that big, but a significant one. And they're all connected basically to one another and nobody else. So they rely really heavily on patronage from imperial officials, which dries up in 1775, even if they wanted to stay. And they were more publicly noticed as loyalists for all of those reasons, because by 1774, it's hard even to maintain a neutral standpoint, because even that starts to get read in the community as loyalist, for better or for worse. So once the war starts, most of the loyalist printers stay behind British lines. A lot of, way disproportionate number of them end up in New York because the British set up their headquarters there for most of the war. And then when the British occupying army leaves, they leave too. So at the end of the war, thinking about loyalists, most of them actually stay in the United States overall, but a majority of the loyalist printers leave. To give you a sense of how this could look, I'll go back to Boston. We're a Massachusetts audience. Through the career of Margaret Draper. She was a member of the Green family, actually, that dated back to the 1640s. She married a man named Richard Draper, who was also a member of the Green family. They're distant cousins. So he ran a printing office with her in Boston for 20 years, publishing a newspaper called the Boston Newsletter, which was explicitly pro-imperial administration. He died in 1774, and she took over the office and ran it and published the newsletter under her name for about 18 months until early 1776, when the British Army leaves Boston for Halifax. She goes with them, with her daughter, and then on to England, and then spent the better part of a decade trying to get compensation from the British government for her and her husband's efforts on behalf of the Crown. Now, she could do that because Parliament established a commission, to hear claims for losses suffered by American loyalists, which means we have an excellent, if probably a little embellished, record of their experience of the war. Oh, sorry, I forgot I had the Green family. So there's the Green family, where locations where they are in the 1760s. I was so excited about Margaret Draper and this record, I forgot about that map. So the Loyalist Claims Commission, I don't know if anyone has an Ancestry.com subscription. If you're interested, it's on Ancestry. I was able to see them before they were digitized for the website at the David Library of the American Revolution, which is outside Philadelphia. So these are really rich records. People were submitting, well, let me tell you about Draper's file. It's one of the largest for any of the printers who filed claims, but it's fairly typical. About 24 printers filed claims with the British. She wrote several petitions in which her own personal narratives talking about her experience. She emphasized her and her husband's steadfast support for the British, even in the face of the threats that they faced. She wrote that she was forced to leave Boston in 1776 because she had, quote, rendered herself more the object of the rancor and malice of the rebels than most others. She was clearly well connected. She had recommendation letters, letters of support from Peter Oliver, who was the Chief Justice of the colony, and General Thomas Gage, who was the military governor. And then she had this is a schedule of the property and income, right? You have to list your assets and the money you thought you had lost. Included in here, I think, is an enslaved person. I think they had a slave, and I think it's on this set of 2 pages. If not, it's on one of the other pages of her record, which is quite long. So she was granted a stipend of £60 per year, which is significantly less than what she claimed, which was about £500 of revenue that she thought the printing office was generating each year. So the loyalists don't face very good prospects, but they left us really nice records of their story. With the war's end, printers began to piece back together the nation. Americans did. Printers helped. Printers played a major role in that. Once the fighting stopped, the trade exploded. Between the end of the war and 1789, just the sheer number of people active in the printing trade doubled. The number of newspapers more than doubled between the end of the war and the time that George Washington took office. But it's not an even development. There's two separate things happening. One, as you probably know, after the war, there's a geographic expansion. White Americans begin to move west off of the coast in very large numbers. Printers follow them. And in those areas, it looks very colonial. It looks a lot like the story I was telling you at the beginning of the talk. A town can barely support one printer, so they're relying on lots of side things to be able to make ends meet. But towns also wanted printers. They wanted the prestige, such as that was, of having a newspaper and having a printer. The other story is what's going on in the coastal cities, really in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, where the trade is beginning to become highly specialized and very large. So the 1780s is when the first daily newspapers are appearing in the United States. They're able to specialize to that extent. There are several commercial papers. These are, I guess it's everything but the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal would be now. Or the financial, it's strictly financial news. It's strictly the ship comings and goings and news like that, modeled on newspapers from London like Lloyd's List. This growth is fueled by immigration, and several of the most important printers in the early United States actually came in this era of the 1780s from England or Ireland. There were also some loyalists who stayed behind. To loud protest, both James Rivington and Hugh Gaines stayed in New York City, and a few came back out of economic necessity. One of my sort of sadly favorite stories is that in Savannah, Georgia, during the war, the printer James Johnston was a loyalist, and so when the British Army was there, he stayed and printed as the King's printer. And then when they drove the army out of Savannah, the state government kicked him out and exiled him to the Bahamas. They confiscated his land and his property. But when the war ended, they actually sent him a petition asking him to come back because they couldn't find anyone else to come to Savannah to print. And he was perfectly happy to do so because they had all of his land and property. So there are situations where loyalists do come back, and there's some situations where they're actually welcomed. So wherever they are, these people are using the same methods to establish their businesses as their forebears. They're trying to make connections through kinship, through trade networks, through government positions. My final example is a printer named Matthew Carey, who was born and raised in Dublin. He was Catholic at birth, which made him a member of that island's oppressed majority. Against his father's wishes, he trained as a printer in Dublin and became active in anti-British political activism. That got him run out of Ireland to France for a year in 1780. Because he was a printer, he tried to find Benjamin Franklin, who was the US American ambassador, and he tried to get work with Franklin, and Franklin was suspicious of him and wouldn't give him a job. Then after he returned to London, he was jailed for publishing an incendiary pamphlet. So incendiary that we only have the advertisement for it. They actually successfully destroyed all copies of the pamphlet that we know of. He was on release before his trial, and so he snuck onto a ship bound for Philadelphia, which he said he picked because he had seen coverage of his plight in that city's newspapers. On the voyage, he stumbled into incredible luck. By chance, also on board that ship from Europe to Philadelphia was the Marquis de Lafayette, Washington's trusted aide from the Revolutionary War, returning to visit. With 6 weeks to listen and moved by Carey's experience, Lafayette wrote him a $400 check towards opening his printing office in Philadelphia. We should be so lucky to have this kind of luck. And he did him even a better favor, got him an introduction to George Washington, the most famous American, the most popular American. So once in Philadelphia, Carey used the money to buy a press at an estate sale and started a newspaper, the Pennsylvania Evening Herald, and then starts to build his network. He's trying to curry favor with people. He continues to try and curry favor with Franklin, and Franklin just is not having it. Franklin did not like him at all. Carey also then got swept up in a movement in the 1780s to try and create an American national culture through print. You may be familiar with people like Noah Webster, who wrote the dictionary. They're all doing this at the same time and part of the same movement. So he started a magazine actually called the American Museum, that was intended to showcase American literature and science and poetry and learning. He promoted national culture through it, and he tried to engage as agents many of his fellow printers up and down the Atlantic seaboard to help him sell it. And he got a recommendation again for the museum, his magazine, from George Washington. It takes a while to set type, but I think we can use this as a benchmark. This is probably the fastest that type has ever been set by hand, is getting this letter from George Washington into a press and in print saying, oh yeah, no, sure, you should subscribe to the museum. So his Lafayette connection worked wonders for him. He then, later in his career, moves into book publishing. He gets out of newspapers. He becomes the publisher for a traveling minister named Mason Locke Weems, who you may have heard of as Parson Weems, who wrote a biography of George Washington. I would not lie to you about that. So he becomes enormously popular, enormously wealthy by the end of his life through book publishing. Like Carey, the younger generation that enters the trade after the war took far bolder stances than the printers who had experienced the imperial crisis. The older printers are just still more cautious than the younger ones. Franklin, back from France and living his last few years in Philadelphia, was appalled at this. He wrote that printers, quote, make no scruple of gratifying the malice of individuals by false accusations of the fairest characters among ourselves, augmenting animosity even to the producing of duels. I don't think he knew how right he was about that. And are moreover so indiscreet as to print scurrilous reflections on the government of neighboring states, and even on the conduct of our best national allies, which may be attended with the most pernicious consequences. In other words, whatever happened to the free and open press? Ironically, his grandson is one of the worst purveyors of partisan news in the 1790s. This is after Franklin's death, but they really pay him little heed as they're building their networks and expressing their opinions. By the time the Constitution was signed, printers are positioning themselves as strongly in favor of the nation. They strongly support the Constitution overall, a few do oppose it. And they took the lead in such events as the Grand Procession. There were these huge parades in several cities, including Philadelphia, and they marched with a float with a printing press on top of it as a guild, essentially, through the city, celebrating their efforts to ratify the Constitution. So fresh off of their influential role in the imperial crisis and the Revolution, printers established themselves as key nodes in the information networks of the new republic. Congress agreed, at least insofar as they made the post office of the United States on a basis that facilitated and subsidized the circulation of news over private correspondence. By the 1790s, as a whole raft of other scholars have shown, printers used those networks to become the key players in the earliest American political parties. And when they did that, they did so through the same business and political networks that they'd been building since the 1760s. So thank you for listening. And for sticking with it. I promised you some marketing, so there's my book cover. I'm obviously we're going to talk, and I'm happy to answer questions now. But if you'd like to email me, that's the best email. If you're on the Twitter, you can come find me at JM Adelman. And yeah, I'm going to stop screen sharing so I can see people and see questions. But I appreciate all of you hanging out and listening tonight.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We did have one question come in the chat already. This is from Liz. She asked, was the pamphlet Carey was printing in London political? What kind of subjects were considered taboo in England at the time?
So he was printing it in Dublin. And oh yeah, was it political? There's it's called the volunteer movement. It's in the 1770s and 1780s, and actually American colonists try and draw on this both for support and solidarity. There was a move by the Catholic majority in England to oppose the rule of the Anglican minority in Ireland. So both the British and the Anglican Irish who had colonized Ireland in the 1500s. And so this was a pamphlet that was in support of the volunteer movement, these volunteer militias that were rising up against British authority and the authority of loyal Irish who were loyal to Britain. So yeah, it was, we know the advertisement and we know indirect evidence of what it actually said, that it was incendiary, that it was not allowed. In England, I mean, one of the problems is that things change very rapidly, and what's considered taboo depends on who's in charge. So there's no licensing in England of printing in the 18th century. There's no, before 1695, you had to have a license from the government to run a printing press. And so printing was relatively limited to London, Cambridge, and Oxford. But that law lapses in 1695, and then printing in newspapers spread all over. There are several famous libel trials during the period, so it's the kinds of things you'd expect in terms of anti-government speech, people who are radicals. There's upticks in it. There's actually a famous case in the 1760s that American colonists, John Wilkes, is arrested and charged with libel for things that he's publishing that are anti-government. In the 1790s, during the French Revolution, there's a huge crackdown on political speech. Yeah, libel is in the eye of the beholder in England. As a law, it's stricter than it is in the colonies or in the United States, but still relatively loose as a regime.
Great. And Rod asks, in the context of the Massachusetts printer who wanted the confirmation for the story of Rodney's leg, when do you see most printers seeking what journalists would call second or multiple sources?
1892? It's a good question. The answer is much later. News is not, I say 1892 jokingly, but that's also the era when journalism became professionalized. So it's when people started thinking of journalism as a thing that is a profession that has a particular set of professional practices, sourcing. That's right around when like the Columbia Journalism School gets founded, right when there's the academic study of it. So the short answer is much later than this period. In this period, they really are dealing on a person-to-person basis for how they're thinking about what they trust. If they're taking a letter from somebody, it's hard to trace that letter. There actually were some cases where I was able to trace it because they were letters written to the printer that happened to also survive. And so I can there's one, it's actually Franklin's partner after Franklin leaves is a guy named David Hall, who was Scottish. He was born and trained as a printer in Edinburgh. And his best friend growing up was a guy named William Strawn, who became King's printer in London. And so Strawn sent letters to David Hall. They remained friends for the rest of their lives. Well, I guess for Hall's life, because Strawn outlived him. And Strawn's letters to Hall survive in the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And so his letters, which have annotations on them, I was able to track and say, oh, look, this paragraph from Strawn's letter is what ends up showing up in Hall's Pennsylvania Gazette. But it's all based on that kind of personal trust and personal, the word they would use is credit. In terms of trusting sources of, do you know this newspaper printer when he prints something? Do you know the person showing you the letter? Do you know the letter writer? And it's all a very ad hoc system of trying to understand sourcing and sources and reliability.
Kimmy asked, did people take out advertisements in the papers for the selling of slaves?
That's a very good question. They absolutely did. In the colonies, slavery was legal in every single colony. So even in the New Hampshire Gazette in Portsmouth and the Boston newspapers, there are ads for the sale of slaves, ads for runaway slaves. So there were, yeah, that was absolutely a part of what was there. And there's actually a really cool Twitter project called, I'm just going to type it in because then called Slave Adverts 250.
Yes.
Which is, it's run by a professor at Assumption College in Worcester named Carl Keyes, who, in self-disclosure, I went to grad school with, so I know him. But he's been running this project, printing from 250 years ago each week. His work is on advertising in early America. And so he's been doing this project where puts in advertisements for slaves from the newspapers and talks about them as part of a long ongoing Twitter project. So if you're interested in more about that, that's a great place to. I think he also has an accompanying blog that has some more information on some of the entries. So
definitely. And if it's of interest for Marvel headers, I have it's not comprehensive by any stretch of the imagination, but I do have a bunch of runaway and sale notices that I will put on our website tomorrow. Actually, I've got them transcribed. So if you go to our website tomorrow, marbleheadmuseum.org, give me a few minutes to get in and get it up, but I'll put it up under the historic documents section so you can look at those.
that's very cool.
Yeah.
The funny ones are the runaway white fans. They really just don't want her using his name as credit. They don't care if she comes back.
Right, exactly. Don't let her send my money for me.
Exactly.
Feel free to unmute yourselves also if you have questions. You don't have to.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, let me ask you a question. This is Darlene Mellis from Salem.
Hi, Darlene.
Hi. So it's very nice. You have a great visual presentation here. So you must know about the visuals.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. So
that's always a preface to a question that I have no idea the answer to. So go ahead.
okay. So those S's that look like F's, they seem to be
yes.
so randomly sprinkled through the spellings.
Yes.
Is there a methodology to that?
Yes, there is. Oh, thank God. A question usually when people compliment that I probably will know an answer, I immediately, it's something I have no idea, but this I do. So those long S's come from, they're called medial S's, and they're used either in the middle or at the ends of words up through about the end of the 18th century. They just disappear from print after 1800. And it's very simply because the printed letters are drawn from the manuscript letters, and there is a manuscript form. The hand that was taught, especially in the 16th and 17th centuries, had a longer S. I'm not sharing screen, it's not worth that, but an S that would be like that rather than just what we would know as the short cursive S, and that my kids would know as, what's that letter? Because we don't learn cursive. So there is that longer S that is reproducing that in print. So it looks like an F. When you're far back, when you get up close, you see there's actually not, I don't know enough about typesetting to know what the little notch in the middle of the F is called, but that's not there on the long S's. And it's drawn from the manuscript form, the way people were taught handwriting when they convert it into the letters. Some printers used it more than others. Some printers tended to capitalize nouns more than others, for example, which German nouns are capitalized. And so that is still a practice in some English language publications of the 18th century. So yeah, no, it's a really good question. I have sort of in my head with a chalkboard, a pre-prepped 5-minute lecture on that, because every time when I teach this kind of stuff in a classroom, I know that that's one of the first 3 questions that's going to come up. So it's a really good question, and it comes from the handwriting, and it just disappears right around 1800. They just stop using it. So thank you for that, Darlene. I'm
curious, when the printers would move away because they had to during the Rev War, did they take their apprentices with them? Did they take their staff, so to speak, with them? Or they kind of were like, all right, you guys are on your own, go join the army or whatever, and I'm going to go save? It varies.
Okay. So apprentices, the sort of standard apprenticeship is 7 years from about the age of 14 to about the age of 21. So as you suggest, and I think I suggested this too in the talk, some of them are running off to war for any of the number of reasons that young men run off to join the army or join their militias or whatever. They're off fighting. So they do lose some. Some printers are declared essentially essential employees by the colony or the state, that they don't have to serve their militia duty because they're needed to continue printing. So in terms of the older master printers, that does happen. Some do end up serving in the military, though. I think it just widely varies. I mean, their goal is to take as much stuff as they can when they leave, as they can. Isaiah Thomas famously pulls down his entire printing press and packs it up on a wagon and takes it out to Worcester, and then resets it up and on May 3rd, prints his first newspaper in Worcester, and then stays there for the rest of his life. One of the things that sort of completes the circle for this is that he ends up also becoming a wealthy publisher and founds the American Antiquarian Society, which is why they have all of his papers and newspapers. And they still have that press. That press is on display in the reading room that he carted out of Boston on April 16th, 1775. He left a couple days early because things were getting hot. It depended on how quick they were trying to get into town, how much stuff they could take with them, whether the apprentices were of the same political inclinations as them, all of which are sort of that I couldn't, it'd be hard to generalize on that just because there are so many different reactions. And then you add on top of it that not a lot of people are talking about the teenagers when they're right. Right, I took my press, like they care a lot about the press. The press is valuable. I think they can find more teenagers.
Katie?
That same way, how about, for instance, the loyalists who had to leave, were most of them able to take their presses with them? And did they continue, anti-US broadsides, after the war, maybe in Canada if they came back, or what happened to those guys? The diaspora of the loyalists, okay?
Yes, thank you for that, Katie. I'm going to give you I'll explain more, but I'm going to give you every historian's favorite answer and every historical audience's least favorite answer, which is it depends. So without the protection of the British Army, what often happens to the loyalist printers is that their offices are ransacked. And so the Sons of Liberty, a militia, are pretty intent on destroying their ability to publish for the very reasons that you suggest, right? If they're going to keep printing, they're going to keep printing stuff that they oppose, the Sons of Liberty. So without the protection of the British Army, they're out of luck. On the other hand, with the protection of the British Army, they either are able to keep printing and so keep doing that, or the British, because they're interested in continuing to have a printing presence, they'll get you a press. Not least that they'll go confiscate, if a Patriot printer had to abandon his shop quickly enough that he left behind his printing press, well, my goodness, you can just use that one, can't you? So the short answer is it depends. The longer answer is it depends on whether you have the protection of the British Army if you're a loyalist, and how quickly that happens. But yeah, the ones who are in, James Rivington is the worst. He's in New York. He is enormously popular as a loyalist printer before the war. Sons of Liberty, there is evidence as far away as Newport, certainly, that they're talking about him and like trying to figure out how can we get rid of this guy. And at that point, they're not willing to destroy his office until after fighting actually starts. And then he's forced to leave in 75, and then he comes back once the British occupy New York and is the king's printer and publishes news. He calls them he doesn't call them from the rebel papers. He calls them from the Sleeper. He refuses to spell rebels frontways. He spells it backwards as a sort of sign of disrespect. But then as the war is coming to a close, he sort of like softens his tone, and it turns out he was probably a spy for George Washington while he was in New York for the British. So if you've ever seen the show Turn on AMC, the Culper spy ring, people who work on espionage in the Revolution are pretty sure that he was part of that. And so he ends up staying. Nobody knows that he was a spy, because if people find out you're a spy.
Yeah.
So everybody in New York is mad at him, but he's able to stay, and that may be the reason why.
Thank you. That's really cool.
Rod asked if you could describe the kind of printing press that Matthew Carey would have bought with the 400 Lafayette game.
Sure. So what he does, this is the short answer, is an old one. He doesn't use all of the money on a printing press, and actually press itself is not the most expensive equipment. But what he gets it at an estate sale. So it's an older press that the printer had passed away, and the wife and sons were essentially forced to sell and couldn't stay in business. So he buys the press, and the most expensive equipment was the types. A press, most of it is wood. And so you need an iron screw, but everything other than the iron screw is carpentry, essentially. It's a little more complicated than that, but it's carpentry. So a lot of it, there's plenty of wood to use. There's lots of resources. You need to be able to do the screw. But the type, until after the Revolution, there's no one making type in the United States. It all has to be imported. And so it's heavy. So it's a lot of metal. And so that's usually the most expensive. So he spends a significant amount of money on a relatively old set, or probably several sets of type of different sizes. Some what we'd call italic, some regular. Yeah, what it would be is, I'm sorry, Rod asked about paper handling. It's one sheet at a time. I don't have any images with me. But it's essentially, there's a flat form that you put a single piece of paper on and then fold down onto the type sits on the level of the press, and you ink it and then slide it underneath the press, which is literally just a huge heavy weight. And then you pull the press to literally push the paper onto the ink and then pull it out. And it's usually, the paper is slightly damp. So the ink doesn't run. So in the early 20th century, you'd have news hot off the presses. This, you'd have news damp off the presses. But yeah, it's one sheet of paper at a time, which is why you need a two-man team. You have one dry person and one wet person, one dirty person and one clean person working a press, so that the paper doesn't get ink all over it. They could do about 250 sheets in an hour if they were actually going at a good clip, right? So paper down, under, pull, out, paper off, new piece of paper on. Could do about 250 sheets an hour. So could do 2,000 sheets in a day, which you then need to let dry overnight before you print the other side. So this is why a newspaper is not the only thing you're printing. A lot of them would have printed about 1,000 copies. So you print, on the first day, you print the pages 1 and 4 that are on one side facing the same way. Let it dry overnight, and then you have the typeset and print pages 2 and 3 the other day. But yeah, there's not multi-sheet printers. Those are industrial. So that's 1830s, 1840s at the absolute earliest, and probably later that they'd have any sort of spread beyond London and New York.
Anything? Any last questions?
Hi, it's Mr. Mellis. Hi, I'm wondering, to generalize seriously, were printers generally idealists, ideologues, or were they pragmatists, businessmen?
They tend to be more, with the caveat that they're never usually one or the other, they tend to be more pragmatists. They're artisans. They wake up and they work for 12 hours, and that's 6 days a week. Some of them had very strong political or ideological ideas. A lot of them did not. I mean, in that sense, I guess they're like most people. There are some people with very strong ideological positions, and most people have some positions and have some inclinations, but they're trying to get through the day. And what's interesting about this period is the ways in which because of that, those interests end up intersecting and interacting and sometimes conflicting in really odd ways. So it's very unexpected that the very first reaction of news of the Stamp Act is we're going to sell copies of the Stamp Act. Patriots, loyalists, like all of them, they just want to they start by making some money off of the deal because they know that other people are interested. That's their instinct, is to do that.
Great. Well, thank you, Professor. Thank you so much. That was
Thank you.
wonderful talk.
Yeah.
And thank you all for joining us. And next Thursday, we have a free talk coming up by Reverend Dr. Clyde Grubbs, who will be speaking. His title of his talk is "What Happened? No, wait a minute. Let me get this right. I'm going to get this right. What really happened in 1492? Sorry.
Oh.
And this is our first event for our celebration of Indigenous Peoples Day alongside the Task Force Against Discrimination. So I hope you can join us for that. You just register right on our website, get the Zoom link, and we'll see you then. So thank you all, and thank you, Professor. Have a good night, everybody.
It's cool.